My grandfather announced that he would sell the farm, using part of the money to fulfill his final dream, a train journey across America, and the rest to be divided equally among his children, provided they accompanied him and took care of him. But on the day of departure, the entire family abandoned him at the train station, leaving him lost and alone with his old suitcase. They thought they had secured the $1.2 million in their grasp, unaware that he held a secret that would leave them all stunned. Hello, my name is Christian Brown. I'm 32 years old, an investigative journalist living in Nashville, Tennessee, a place where neon lights glow and the sound of country guitars echoes through every street corner. My job isn't as glamorous as people might imagine journalism to be. No stage lights, no flashy press conferences, just me, stacks of documents piled high like mountains, and stories that society often chooses to turn away from. I dig into the shadows, from cases of financial abuse within families to small-scale local corruption schemes. To me, these stories aren't just news. They are the voices of the forgotten, the trampled, and sometimes those betrayed by their own kin. And perhaps deep down, it all stems from one day 8 years ago, a day I can never erase from my mind. Tonight, like many other nights, I sit in the small office of the newsroom, surrounded by a silence broken only by the clacking of my keyboard and the low hum of the computer fan. On my desk lies a chaotic pile of papers, bank statements, real estate contracts, and affidavits from elderly people whose assets were seized by their own children or grandchildren. My latest series of articles is taking shape, a story about greed and betrayal within the supposedly sacred walls of family. I've spent months pursuing this topic, interviewing elderly individuals with clouded eyes and trembling voices. Each story they share is a cut, but also a flame that drives me to keep going. I want to expose the truth to force society to confront what they usually ignore. I reach for my cold cup of coffee, trying to stay alert. The clock on the wall shows it's nearly midnight. The newsroom is empty now, just me, a lone shadow amidst the clutter of papers. I flip through my old notebook where I jot down random ideas and snippets of stories yet to be written. The cover is worn, the pages yellowed with time. I turn through them, reading the scribbled lines until something small slips out, landing on the desk with a faint click. I look down. It's an old train ticket, its edges frayed, the ink faded to near illegibility. But I don't need to read it. I know exactly what it is. I know it too well. That ticket, though 8 years have passed, still cuts like a razor, slicing through the veneer of time to drag me back to that day. Atlanta Union Station, a noisy morning filled with the blare of announcements and the rush of strangers. My grandfather, Henry Brown, stood there amidst the unfamiliar crowd. An old man with white hair, frail shoulders, clutching his weathered suitcase as if it were the only thing keeping him upright. His eyes, God, those eyes, empty, lost yet still holding on to a shred of final pride. I still remember the heat rushing to my head, my heart constricting as I realized what was happening. My family, my own flesh and blood, had abandoned him right there at the station, as if he were nothing more than a piece of worthless luggage. I pick up the ticket, my fingers brushing its rough surface. It's not just a piece of paper. It's a reminder, a scar that never healed. I set the ticket back on the desk, but the memories don't let go so easily. I close my eyes, trying to push the image away, but it clings to me. My grandfather standing alone in the crowd of strangers. Me, just a 24-year-old kid frozen in place, helpless as I watched him being left behind. That feeling of powerlessness 8 years later still weighs on my chest like a stone. I open my eyes, looking around the room. The neon lights still flicker, as if reminding me I'm still here in the present, with my work. But that ticket has pulled me back, forcing me to face a truth I've never truly escaped. Everything I do today, my journalism, my investigative articles, my obsession with exposing the truth, stems from that day. The day I realized family isn't always a safe haven. The day I learned that sometimes the elderly, those seen as frail, are the ones who see through people the most clearly. I wonder if that day hadn't happened, would I be the person I am now? A journalist ready to unearth the darkest corners, undeterred by threats or scornful looks? I'm not sure. But what I do know is that this train ticket, though never used, has led me on a different journey. One without an end, where I seek justice not just for others but for my grandfather too. I close the notebook, carefully tucking the ticket back inside. It's late, but I know I won't sleep. Not tonight. The memory of my grandfather, of Atlanta Station, of my family's betrayal is still too vivid. I stand up, turn off the light, and walk out of the newsroom. The Nashville night air is cool, carrying the scent of hay and the faint sound of country music drifting from somewhere nearby. I walk on, carrying the ticket in my mind, carrying the story I know one day I'll have to tell. Not just to expose the truth, but to give my grandfather, the man who taught me about pride and truth, the justice he deserves. Our house, if you could even call it a home, was never truly a haven. My father, Howard Brown, was a banker, always consumed by numbers and late-night meetings. My mother, Cheryl, worked in real estate, constantly bustling with contracts and endless phone calls. They were successful, at least by society's standards, but to me they were like two strangers passing through our own home. The rare family dinners were filled with cold questions. How was your test today? Have you done your homework? Don't embarrass us at school. There were no hugs, no questions that genuinely cared about how I felt. I grew up in a house full of material wealth, but empty of emotional warmth. Every summer when school let out, my parents would pack my bags and send me to my grandfather Henry's farm on the outskirts of Tennessee. I still remember those long car rides, sitting in the back seat, staring out the window at the endless fields. My heart a mix of excitement and apprehension. Excitement because I could escape the stifling atmosphere at home. But apprehension because I knew at the farm it would just be me and him, a frail, white-haired old man with stories I wasn't sure I'd understand. But oh, those summers were the most beautiful days of my childhood. My grandfather's farm sat in a small valley surrounded by golden cornfields and ancient oak trees. His wooden house was simple, with a wide porch and an old armchair by the front door. Every afternoon, as the sun began to cast its golden glow, he and I would sit there on the time-worn wooden steps. He'd pour me a glass of homemade lemonade while he sipped on mint tea. And then he'd start telling stories. His stories were unlike anything I'd ever heard. He spoke of train journeys across America, from New York to Chicago, through the vast prairies of Denver, all the way to San Francisco, where the ocean sparkled under the sunset. He had worked on those trains in his youth, when railroads were the lifeblood of the nation. His voice was warm, sometimes interrupted by a hoarse laugh, but always full of emotion. He told me about the passengers he met, a single mother clutching her child, hoping for a new start, an old man returning to his hometown after half a century, or a young man dreaming of striking it big out west. Each story was a piece of a puzzle, as if he were painting an entire picture of America before my eyes. I sat there, at 10, then 12, then 15, my legs swinging on the steps, eyes wide, hanging on to his every word. Once I asked him, "How do you remember so much?" He smiled, the kind of smile that deepened the wrinkles on his face. "Christian, trains don't just carry people. They carry stories. And if you listen, you'll find that everyone has a story worth telling." Those afternoons planted a seed in me. I started writing. At first, it was just scribbles in a small notebook he gave me as a birthday gift when I turned 8. I wrote down his stories, trying to mimic the way he told them, the way he made every detail come alive. Today, Grandpa told me about the ticket seller in Chicago who always kept a rose in his pocket to give to the saddest passengers. Or, he talked about the blizzard in Denver when the train stopped and everyone shared their bread with each other. Those lines weren't just memories to me. They were my first little articles, though I didn't know then that I'd become a journalist. Grandpa Henry wasn't just a storyteller. He was my anchor, the only person who truly saw me, not through my grades or achievements, but through my dreams and fears. Once I confided in him that I didn't know what I wanted to do when I grew up. My father wanted me to study finance, my mother wanted me to be a lawyer. But he just placed a hand on my shoulder, his eyes gleaming. "Christian, you don't have to do what others want. You just need to find what makes your heart sing." Those words were like a spark. When the time came to choose a college major, I stood before the application forms, my mind flooded with images of those afternoons on the porch, his voice and his stories of the trains. I didn't choose finance or law. I chose journalism. I wanted to tell stories about people, about justice, about truths buried beneath the surface, just like he had told me about those train journeys. I wanted to be a journalist, not just to write, but to expose the things society often turns away from, to protect people like him, those who may grow old, but whose souls remain forever bright. Those summers at the farm shaped me. They taught me how to listen, how to see into the hearts of others, and how to never give up on seeking the truth. But above all, they taught me about my grandfather, a man who spent his entire life living authentically, loving deeply, and believing that every story deserved to be told. Those memories always bring me back to those warm days, but they also remind me that not every story has a happy ending. And the story I'm about to tell, the story of a Christmas Eve 8 years ago, is the clearest proof of that. When I was 24, I had just graduated college and was taking my first steps into journalism as a rookie reporter at a local newspaper in Nashville. Life back then was filled with long days chasing news, sleepless nights writing articles, and youthful dreams of changing the world with my pen. That Christmas, for the first time in years, my entire family gathered at Grandpa Henry's old farm. My parents, Howard and Cheryl, along with my Aunt Paula and cousins Isabel and James, were all there. The familiar wooden house glowed with warm yellow lights. A Christmas tree stood in the corner of the room, sparkling with tinsel and red ornaments. The smell of burning wood in the fireplace mingled with the scent of cinnamon from the cookies my mother baked. A rare moment when my family actually felt like a family. We sat around the dining table, plates of steaming turkey and mashed potatoes before us. I looked at my grandfather, now in his 70s, his hair snow white, his hands frail but still carrying his characteristic calm. He sat at the head of the table, his gaze sweeping over each of us as if searching for something deep within. Then, amidst the laughter and clinking of wine glasses, he stood up, slowly tapping his wine glass with a silver spoon. The clear sound rang out, cutting through the noise. The room fell silent, all eyes turning to him. "Everyone, I have something to say," he began, his voice low but clear. "I've lived a long life. I've seen America through its trains, from the East Coast to the West, from vibrant cities to desolate plains. But now I'm old, and I have one final dream." He paused, taking a deep breath, his eyes gleaming like a flame. "I want to take one last train journey across America, from New York to San Francisco. I want to see this country again one last time before I close my eyes." The room went still. My heart raced, a mix of emotion and excitement. I pictured him on a train, gazing at cornfields and distant mountains, just as he had described in his stories. But the moment was quickly shattered. My father, Howard, let out a faint laugh as if he'd just heard a joke. "Dad, dreaming like that at your age?" he said, trying to keep his tone light but unable to hide the mockery. My mother, Cheryl, glanced at him and added, "That kind of trip would be dangerous, Dad. The doctor told you to rest." Aunt Paula, always sharp and pragmatic, clicked her tongue. "A trip like that would be expensive, Dad. And with your health, it might do more harm than good." None of them took his dream seriously. None of them noticed the fleeting sadness in his eyes, like a breeze passing over a lake. The atmosphere grew heavy, tense. I looked at him, wanting to say something, to defend his dream. But I was just a rookie reporter, too young to stand up to the whole family. My grandfather gave a small smile, as if accustomed to their indifference. Then he continued, his voice calm but carrying an undeniable weight. "I know I'm old, and this farm is no longer something I can care for. I've decided to sell it. The money will be divided equally between my 2 children. Howard and Paula. The room suddenly buzzed with energy again. My father sat up straight, his eyes lighting up. My mother set her wine glass down, trying to hide a smile. Aunt Paula couldn't contain herself, exclaiming, "Dad, really? The farm is worth a lot." A chill ran down my spine. I knew what they were thinking, not about him, but about the money. But my grandfather wasn't finished. He raised his hand, signaling for silence. "But there's one condition," he said, his voice sharp as a blade. "Part of the money must be used to organize the cross-country train trip I just mentioned, for the whole family. After the trip, find me a good nursing home so I can live out my days in peace." The family's reaction shifted as quickly as a flipped switch. My father, who had just mocked his dream, now clapped enthusiastically. "Wonderful, Dad. A trip to remember. We'll make it spectacular." My mother nodded eagerly, adding, "We'll find the best nursing home, Dad, don't worry." Aunt Paula, with a saccharine smile, took his hand. "You deserve a trip like this, Dad. We'll take care of everything." I sat there watching them, a growing unease stirring in my chest. Their promises, their smiles felt so hollow. I knew they didn't care about his dream. They only saw the money from the farm, the benefit to themselves. But in that moment, I felt a spark of hope. I imagined the whole family on a train with my grandfather. I thought of the articles I could write from the trip, a feature about family, about memories, about trains. I looked at my grandfather and he looked back at me. His gaze was deep, as if he could see the entire world within me. He gave a slight nod, a small but meaningful gesture. I knew he understood, that I was the only one who truly valued his dream. But I also saw something else in his eyes, a seasoned wisdom, as if he already knew how everything would unfold. What I didn't know then was that my grandfather was putting the entire family to a test. He knew full well the greed in his children's hearts, but he still wanted to give them one last chance, a chance to prove they had some shred of humanity left before it was too late. The days following that Christmas Eve, the atmosphere in the family shifted in a strange way, like a play staged too hastily, too blatantly. My parents and Aunt Paula, people I rarely saw together except on holidays, suddenly became so attentive it gave me chills. They visited Grandpa more often, bringing boxes of cookies, cheap bottles of wine, and smiles I knew were fake. "How's your health, Dad? Are you eating well? Just let us know if you need anything." The questions poured from their mouths, sweet as honey, but they sent a shiver down my spine. I wasn't naive. I knew they didn't truly care about Grandpa. Those visits, those small gifts, those inquiries, all were just a pretext. They came to probe, to suss out whether Grandpa had started the process of selling the farm, how the money would be divided, and when they could get their hands on their share. Every time I heard my father ask about plans for the farm, or Aunt Paula sweetly say, "Dad, let us take care of finding you a great nursing home," I wanted to jump up and scream that it was all lies, but I stayed silent. I looked at Grandpa, searching his eyes for a hint of disappointment, but he only smiled, a calm, profound smile, as if he had seen through everything long ago. Then the plan was laid out, swiftly and with such detail that it stunned me. My father, usually cold and meticulous, printed out a dense itinerary on A4 paper and passed it around as if it were a contract. "The trip will take place next Christmas," he declared, his voice brimming with feigned excitement. "We'll start in New York, go through Chicago, Denver, and end in San Francisco, concluding in Los Angeles. A trip of a lifetime, just as Grandpa wanted." My mother, with her sharp real estate agent's eye, chimed in. "I've calculated the costs. 4-star hotels, local specialty restaurants. It'll be perfect." Aunt Paula, not to be outdone, added in a voice as sweet as sugar, "Dad, this is the trip you deserve after a lifetime of hard work. But to book tickets and services early, we need a solid funding source. What do you think about selling the farm a bit sooner?" I sat there in Grandpa's small living room, listening to them talk, feeling as though a stone were pressing on my chest. They spoke of his trip, but not one of them truly talked about him, about his dream, about why he wanted to see America one last time. It was all about the money, about how to quickly sell the farm, split the proceeds, and turn his dream into an excuse for their own gain. I looked at Grandpa, waiting for him to say something, to object, to get angry. But he remained silent. He nodded, his gaze oddly calm, as if he had anticipated everything. "All right," he said softly. "I'll finalize the sale of the farm this month." And true to his word, a few weeks later, Grandpa completed the sale of the farm. After deducting debts and taxes, he was left with a staggering sum, $1.2 million. It was divided equally between my father and Aunt Paula, $600,000 each. I overheard my parents discussing the money, talking about how they would invest it or use it wisely. But not one of them mentioned organizing Grandpa's trip with any sincerity. A sense of unease crept into my heart like a cold wind blowing through. I wanted to talk to him, to urge him to reconsider, to tell him that my parents and Aunt Paula weren't trustworthy. But every time I looked into his eyes, I saw a strange resolve, as if he held a secret I couldn't yet grasp. I didn't want to dampen his spirits, didn't want to ruin the dream of the train journey he'd been cherishing. So I stayed silent, though my heart was heavy. They continued preparing for the trip, or rather they continued performing their act. My father booked train tickets, my mother selected luxurious hotels, and Aunt Paula incessantly called travel agencies to ensure everything was perfect. But deep down, I knew it was all a sweet trap. They didn't care about Grandpa or his dream. They only saw the $600,000 in their hands, and this trip to them was merely a way to justify their greed. The day of departure finally arrived. Early in the morning, the atmosphere at Atlanta Union Station was as bustling as a disturbed beehive. Passengers dragged their suitcases past one another. The loudspeaker blared continuously, announcing trains about to depart. The aroma of coffee wafted from a small cafe near the concourse, mingling with the sounds of laughter and the clatter of suitcase wheels on the stone floor. I stood there, pulling Grandpa Henry's old suitcase. He stood beside me, his white hair peeking out from under a worn baseball cap, his eyes gleaming as if he'd shed decades of age. He gripped the suitcase handle tightly, murmuring familiar names. Chicago, Denver, San Francisco. Each name was a heartbeat, a dream I knew he'd cherished his entire life. I looked at him, my heart brimming with excitement. I imagined this journey would be the trip of a lifetime, not just for him, but for me too. I had prepared a new notebook, ready to capture every moment, every story he'd tell on the train. I wanted to write a feature, not just for publication, but to preserve his legacy. The man who taught me that every train carries a story. My parents, Howard and Cheryl, along with Aunt Paula, Isabel, and James, gathered nearby, pulling their shiny, expensive suitcases. They laughed and chatted loudly as if this were a luxurious vacation they'd long awaited. But I couldn't help noticing the forced nature of their smiles, as if they were hiding something. As the family approached the ticket counter, a cold chill ran down my spine. My father and Aunt Paula walked ahead, but they avoided my gaze, whispering something to each other and to the ticket agent. I tried not to overthink it, but a bad feeling clung to me. Grandpa stood beside me, still clutching his suitcase, still murmuring about Chicago, the cornfields he'd seen, the shimmering ocean in San Francisco. I placed a hand on his shoulder, giving a small smile. "It's going to be great, Grandpa," I said, trying to keep my voice upbeat. He looked at me, his eyes brightening, but there was something profound in them, as if he were seeing through me, through the moment itself. Then the truth hit like a sharp knife slicing through the air. The ticket agent, a middle-aged woman with a tired face, looked at the screen, then hesitated before speaking. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice soft but clear. "I don't see Henry Brown on the reservation." The world around me seemed to stop. The loudspeaker, the chatter, the laughter, all faded, leaving only the agent's voice and Grandpa's bewildered expression. He turned to my father, then to Aunt Paula, as if waiting for an explanation. But my father only sighed, feigning awkward remorse. "Dad, your health is weak," A trip this long is too dangerous. The doctor said you shouldn't travel far. Let us go this time and we'll plan a shorter trip for you next time, all right? I stood there, my blood boiling. My father's words, cloaked in concern, couldn't hide their deceit. I looked to my mother, hoping she'd say something, correct the situation, but she just lowered her head, pretending to adjust her scarf. Aunt Paula pursed her lips, her gaze skimming past Grandpa as if he were merely an obstacle. Grandpa stood still, his frail shoulders trembling slightly, not from anger, but from a deep, painful disappointment, as if he had known this would happen but still hoped he was wrong. Amid the noisy station concourse, the image of him standing there, clutching his suitcase, his eyes empty, pierced my heart like a dagger. My parents and Aunt Paula began to turn away, adjusting their luxurious suitcases and heading toward the train platform. They didn't look back, not once. I stood rooted to the spot, feeling as if the world were collapsing beneath me. I had seen this image before in nightmares, in my worst fears. But now it was real. They were abandoning him right here in a sea of strangers. My father turned back, his eyes cold and sharp. "Christian, don't be foolish," he snapped. "Get on the train. Let your grandfather take a bus home." My blood surged with rage. I looked at my father, my mother, Aunt Paula, and felt a fury so powerful I could barely control it. "I won't leave him here alone and lost," I said, my voice trembling with anger. My father glared, calling me a foolish kid. Aunt Paula gave a faint, condescending laugh, her eyes dripping with disdain as if I'd just thrown away a golden opportunity. But I didn't care. I turned to Grandpa, slipping my arm around him, feeling his frail hand tremble in mine. "Let's go, Grandpa," I said, my voice soft but firm. "I'll take you home." What surprised me most was his reaction. He didn't get angry, didn't raise his voice, didn't utter a single word of reproach. Instead, he gave a faint smile, waved to my parents and Aunt Paula, his voice eerily calm. "Have a good trip," he said, as if he were seeing them off on a routine vacation. I was stunned. How could he be so calm? How could he smile when his own children had just betrayed him? But when I looked into his eyes, I saw understanding, as if he had anticipated this moment and prepared for it long ago. Amid the rushing crowd at Atlanta Station, the two of us walked away quietly. His calloused hand gripped mine tightly, strong and warm, a sign that the bond between us remained unbroken. But with the others, my parents, Aunt Paula, that bond was severed. From that moment, they were no longer family. They had turned themselves into strangers. It was just me and Grandpa standing by each other, walking out of the station concourse, carrying the old suitcase and a silent wound. The cold Atlanta wind swept through, carrying the scent of coffee from the station concourse and the heavy weight in my heart. I pulled Grandpa's worn suitcase, walking slowly beside him, trying to match my steps to his deliberate pace. But in my mind, everything was spiraling. The image of my father, his cold voice telling Grandpa to take a bus home, Aunt Paula's contemptuous glance, and my mother's silence, all sliced into my heart like knives. I couldn't bear it. Rage flared up, hot and uncontainable. "Grandpa," I blurted out, my voice trembling with fury, "why did you let them take all the money like that? They don't deserve your love. They plan to abandon you from the start." I stopped, panting, my chest feeling like it might explode. In my eyes, Grandpa was now a man utterly deceived, betrayed by his own children. And me, I felt powerless, like a child watching the person I loved most get hurt, unable to do anything. I wanted to scream, to storm back to the station, to confront my parents and Aunt Paula, to make them pay. But Grandpa just paused, looking at me. His eyes were deep, devoid of anger, holding only a strange calm. He sighed, his voice low and gentle like a breeze passing over the cornfields of old. "Grandson," he said, "there are journeys you must take without a train ticket. We've just been on one of those." His words stunned me. They were vague, like a riddle without an answer, leaving me even more confused. "What journey, Grandpa?" I asked, my voice nearly desperate, but he didn't answer right away. He just kept walking, his hand still gripping mine, as if guiding me through a journey I couldn't yet understand. We left the station area, stepping out onto Atlanta's bustling streets. I suggested taking him to my small apartment in Nashville, where I'd been living alone since starting my job as a reporter. "Stay with me for a few days, Grandpa," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'll take care of you." He nodded, giving a faint smile, but that smile unsettled me. On the drive back in my beat-up old car, silence hung between us. The hum of the engine blended with the sound of wind slipping through the cracked window. I glanced at him, seeing him sit there, his gaze fixed on the stretching roads as if looking back on an entire lifetime. Then out of the blue he spoke, his voice low and deliberate. "Christian, money can buy a ticket, but it can't buy someone's heart. What's lost today isn't necessarily gone for good. Sometimes you have to let people reveal themselves fully to see who stays and who's truly lost." I gripped the steering wheel tightly, trying to make sense of his words. "What are you talking about, Grandpa? I don't understand." I pressed, my voice thick with confusion. "They took your money. They abandoned you. How can you be so calm?" But he just looked at me, his deep eyes glinting with a spark, as if he saw through me, through everything that had just happened. He placed his calloused hand on my shoulder, gently but firmly. "You did the right thing," he said. "Don't be so quick to despair. You'll understand why I stayed silent." His words, like a cold gust, sent a shiver through me. I wanted to ask more, to force him to explain, but I knew he wouldn't say anything further. Grandpa was always like that. He never revealed everything he was thinking, like a man holding a lantern, shining just enough light to keep me from getting lost. In my heart, anger still simmered, mingled with a new spark of doubt. Had he seen through everything from the start? Was the sweet trap I thought my parents and Aunt Paula had set actually part of a plan he had anticipated? When we reached my apartment, night had fallen. I helped him carry the suitcase inside, placing it in the corner of my small living room. He sat down in my old armchair, looking around my modest apartment. A few bookshelves, a desk buried in papers, and a small framed photo of him and me on the farm's porch from years ago. I brewed him a cup of tea, trying to hide the frustration brewing inside me. But every time I looked at him, I saw a strange contrast. Me, a young man burning with anger, and him, an old man with an almost deliberate calm. I sat down across from him, wanting to say something to comfort him, but I couldn't find the words. Only one question kept repeating in my mind. "Grandpa, what are you hiding?" The days that followed, Grandpa lived with me. My apartment was cramped, with a fold-out bed in the corner of the living room, a few bookshelves stuffed with old newspapers, and a desk buried under papers. I went to the newsroom during the day, digging through documents for my series on financial abuse of the elderly, then returned in the evenings with simple meals, a plate of stew, some mashed potatoes, or sometimes just bread and canned soup. Grandpa sat across from me by the window, the streetlights casting shadows on his face, highlighting the wrinkles that seemed like small roads leading into the past. We talked about mundane things, the Nashville weather, a case I was working on, or an article I'd read. But between our words, I sensed a void in his eyes. Sometimes he sat silently for hours, his frail hands resting on his knees, staring at the old suitcase in the corner of the room. That suitcase, with its worn leather and tarnished brass lock, seemed to hold an entire lifetime, and secrets I couldn't yet reach. I tried to cheer him up. I told him about my work, about the elderly people I interviewed, about the stories of greed and betrayal I was trying to expose. But every time I mentioned our family, my parents, Aunt Paula, I felt a smoldering anger in my chest. I wanted to ask him, to shout why he let them treat him like that, why he didn't fight back. But I didn't dare. I was afraid of hurting him more, afraid of shattering the calm he was trying to maintain. Instead, I watched quietly, waiting for the day he'd say something, anything, to unravel the riddle he'd posed at the Atlanta station. One late evening, as I was reviewing a draft under the desk lamp, my phone buzzed. A social media notification popped up. Isabel, my cousin Aunt Paula's daughter, had just posted a series of photos from the trip that was meant to be Grandpa's. I scrolled through the images, feeling as if someone were squeezing my heart. They stood on the train's deck, smiling brightly under the sun, with endless fields stretching behind them. They showed off lavish restaurant meals, suitcases full of souvenirs, and photos in front of famous landmarks: Chicago, Denver, San Francisco. My father, my mother, Aunt Paula, Isabel, and James, all there like a happy family, as if they hadn't abandoned Grandpa at the Atlanta station. I gripped the phone tightly, rage surging hot and uncontrollable. "They don't deserve this," I muttered, my voice trembling. They were living the life they'd stolen from him, laughing and enjoying the money that was meant for his dream. I brought the phone to Grandpa, who was sitting by the window with a cold cup of tea. "Grandpa, look at this," I said, holding the screen out to him. "They're bragging about the trip as if they did nothing wrong. As if you don't exist." I waited for a reaction, a frown, a sigh, or even a tear. But he just looked at the screen, his aged eyes flickering with a hint of sadness, but no surprise. He nodded slightly and said, his voice low and firm, "Christian, when they return from their trip, call them here." I let them take their own train. Now it's time for me to show them the real train I've prepared. I was stunned. Call them back? For what, Grandpa? I asked, my voice full of skepticism. But he only smiled, that mysterious smile I'd seen too many times. My mind swirled with questions. What was he planning? After everything they'd done, why did he still want to see them? "Just call them," he said. "I have something to say." I didn't understand what he was thinking, but I followed his instructions. I texted my parents, Aunt Paula, Isabel, and James, inviting them to my apartment that weekend. I said Grandpa wanted to see the whole family, that there was something important to discuss. Inside, I was both curious and anxious. What was Grandpa planning? And why did he remain so calm, as if everything were under his control? That weekend, my small apartment was packed. My father, Howard, sat in the corner of the sofa, arms crossed, his eyes brimming with impatience. My mother, Cheryl, stood near the door, glancing at her watch as if eager to leave. Aunt Paula, with a forced smile, sat beside Isabel and James, my cousins, who were glued to their phones, barely looking up. Grandpa sat in the old armchair in the center of the room, the worn suitcase at his feet. I leaned against the wall, feeling like I was standing on a stage, waiting for a play whose script I didn't know. Grandpa cleared his throat, his gaze sweeping over everyone in the room. The air grew heavy, as if everyone sensed a storm approaching. "Listen, all of you," he began, his voice slow but sharp. "You abandoned me at the train station that day. You thought I was no longer worth exploiting, so you tossed me aside like something useless. But that train was a test. I wanted to see what you truly thought of me, of my dream. And you failed. Only Christian stayed with me." The room fell silent, as if the air had been sucked out. A jolt ran through me, my heart pounding. My father frowned, his eyes cold, as if trying to suppress his anger. "Dad, what do you mean?" "We were just worried about your health," he said, his voice straining to sound sincere. But I heard the deceit in every word. My mother lowered her head, clutching her scarf as if she wanted to vanish from the room. Aunt Paula let out a sharp laugh, her voice high-pitched. "Dad, what are you talking about? We did everything for you." But Grandpa didn't let them speak further. He stood up, walked to the old suitcase, and opened it with a dry click. Then he continued, his voice resounding like a judge delivering a verdict. "The $1.2 million farm was just the surface. I made some quiet investments during my years working on the railroads. They're now worth over $15 million. And I won't give it to those who see their father as a burden. This entire fortune will go to Christian." The room froze. I felt the blood stop flowing in my veins, my breath catching in my chest. Grandpa had $15 million. Impossible. How could he have that much money without anyone in the family knowing? My father's jaw dropped, his eyes wavering between shock and rage. "Dad, are you joking? $15 million? Where did that come from?" he shouted, his voice trembling. Aunt Paula laughed loudly, but it was a strained, disbelieving laugh. "Dad, stop kidding. There's no way," she said, but her eyes were beginning to show panic. My mother, for the first time, looked up at Grandpa, her face as if she'd been betrayed. Isabel and James glanced up from their phones, their expressions blank, as if they couldn't comprehend what was happening. But Grandpa didn't respond. He slowly pulled out a stack of documents from the suitcase. Land deeds, bank statements, savings bonds, stock certificates. He placed them on the table one by one like a card player revealing aces. "Here," he said, his voice calm but sharp as a blade. "You want proof? Here's the proof." I stared at the papers, the numbers, the signatures, my mind reeling. This wasn't a joke. It was real. Grandpa, the man I'd always thought was simple, living his life with just the farm and his stories, had kept a secret this massive. My father shot to his feet, his voice nearly a shout. "You can't do this. This is family money." Aunt Paula jumped in, her voice shrill. "Christian? That kid? What has he done to deserve it?" Isabel and James began muttering, their eyes filled with jealousy and anger. My mother stayed silent, but I saw her hands trembling, as if she were holding back a storm of emotions. I stood there, frozen, not out of joy, but because of the immense responsibility suddenly placed on my shoulders. I didn't want the money. I didn't want to be the center of this fight. But when I looked into Grandpa's eyes, deep, full of trust, as if he were handing me his entire life, I knew I couldn't refuse. Not for the money, but for him. Grandpa raised his hand, signaling silence. "My decision is final," he said, his voice resolute, unwavering. "Now go home. No one can change this." The air in the room seemed to solidify. My father, Aunt Paula, my mother, Isabel, and James stood up, their faces twisted with regret and rage. They left without a goodbye, only bitter glances and heavy footsteps. When the door closed, it was just me and Grandpa in the quiet apartment. I looked at him, wanting to say something, but my throat tightened. He placed a hand on my shoulder, giving a faint smile. "You chose to stand by me," he said, "and I choose you." I sat down, my mind still reeling. I didn't know what I would do with that money, with that responsibility, but I knew one thing. I wouldn't let Grandpa down. Never. After Grandpa announced that he was leaving his secret fortune, $15 million to me, my apartment became the epicenter of a storm. My parents, Howard and Cheryl, along with Aunt Paula, wouldn't leave me alone. My phone buzzed incessantly with calls and messages, their tones shifting from sweet to threatening in just a few days. My father called one early morning, his voice trying to sound calm but betraying tension. "Christian, you can't keep all that money. It's the family's fortune. You have to think of your parents." I listened, my throat bitter with resentment. Family? Since when did they treat Grandpa like family? Aunt Paula sent long, accusatory messages. "Who do you think you are taking my share? You manipulated Grandpa, didn't you? What did you do to make him give it all to you?" Each word was like a knife, not because it hurt me, but because it showed how little they truly understood Grandpa. My mother, Cheryl, was quieter, but her silence was more terrifying than any threat. One day she showed up at my apartment, standing at the door with a weary posture, her eyes red as if she'd been crying. "Christian," she said, her voice trembling, "do you know how hard I worked to raise you? You can't do this to me, to the family." I looked at her, wanting to believe it was remorse, but her eyes betrayed a glint of calculation, as if she were trying to extract pity from me. Isabel and James, my cousins, sent short but bitter messages. "You're selfish, Christian. You stole everything from us." I read those messages, heard those calls, and felt a mix of anger and shock. I never imagined I'd become the center of a family feud, where the people I loved most turned into enemies. But amid that storm, I realized one thing. I couldn't let them keep hurting Grandpa, not just legally, but in terms of honor. The honor of a man who had lived his entire life for truth and pride. I was a journalist, And if there was anything I'd learned from those summers on the farm's porch, listening to Grandpa's stories about trains, it was the power of truth. I decided to use my pen, not just to protect him, but to expose the truth about what my family had done and what Grandpa had endured. I began as I would with any investigative article, gathering evidence. I reviewed old messages and calls from my parents and Aunt Paula during the months leading up to the train trip. Their saccharine promises, their assurances of a grand trip for Grandpa, I documented meticulously. I listened to recordings I'd secretly kept, not out of initial suspicion, but because my journalist's habit compelled me to save everything. In those recordings, my father's voice was cold and calculating. Once he sells the farm, it'll be easy. Aunt Paula laughed mockingly. He's old. He doesn't need to travel far. Just put him in a nursing home. Each word was a stab, but also a piece of the story I was about to tell. I dug deeper, cross-referencing financial records and documents related to the farm's sale. I discovered that the $1.2 million had been swiftly transferred to my father's and Aunt Paula's personal accounts. Not a single cent spent on organizing the trip as promised. Each piece of evidence was a brick, building a wall of truth I would raise before them. With that evidence, I sat down and began to write. My series was titled When Family Becomes the Abuser. I didn't name names, only wrote about an elderly man whose final dream was a train journey across America, and how his own flesh and blood exploited that dream to seize his assets. I wrote about the day he was abandoned at the train station, about his empty gaze, and how greed turned loved ones into strangers. Each sentence was a stroke of the pen, not just to expose the truth, but to restore the justice Grandpa deserved. The article was published in the local Nashville paper, but it quickly spread, shared on social media, and picked up by other outlets. It sparked a heated discussion about the financial abuse of the elderly, not just in Tennessee, but across the country. Strangers emailed me, sharing their own stories of elderly people exploited by their children, of families torn apart by greed. I read those letters feeling both proud and pained. Proud because I'd done what Grandpa always taught me, tell the important stories. Pained because that story was my own family's. My family's reaction was another storm. My father called the moment the article was published, his voice nearly a shout over the phone. "Christian, you've gone too far. You dare smear the whole family. Who do you think you are, you bastard?" I listened, my heart growing cold. This was the father who once taught me to ride a bike, who took me fishing, but now he was just a man blinded by greed. I didn't respond, just quietly hung up. Aunt Paula was more aggressive. She stormed into the newsroom, standing at my desk, pointing in my face and yelling, "You'll pay for this, Christian. You think you can ruin my reputation with a few cheap articles? I'll sue you." Her face was flushed, her eyes gleaming with anger and fear. I looked her in the eye, my voice calm but firm. "You want to sue? Go ahead. I have evidence. Everything." She stepped back, her eyes wavering, then turned and left. But I knew she wouldn't dare act. They didn't dare because the truth was on my side. My mother reacted differently. She didn't yell or threaten, but sent a handwritten letter, a rarity in this age. In it, she wrote, "Christian, I never thought you'd do this to the family. I sacrificed my whole life for you, and yet you turned your back on me. I only wanted the best for Grandpa." I read the letter, and for the first time I felt a pang of sorrow. But then I remembered her eyes at the Atlanta station, her silence when my father told Grandpa to take a bus home. That letter wasn't remorse. It was a final attempt to manipulate me. I folded it, tucked it into a drawer, and told myself I wouldn't let them drag me into their deceit. Isabel and James, my cousins, publicly attacked me on social media. Isabel posted a long status calling me a family traitor and a greedy thief who stole Grandpa's fortune. James shared my article with a comment, "Don't believe this guy. He's just chasing fame." Their words stung like needles, but I didn't respond. I knew that if I let my emotions take over, I'd lose myself. Instead, I kept working, kept telling Grandpa's story. The climax came at a community meeting organized by local authorities to discuss policies protecting the elderly. I was invited as the journalist who had written on the topic. Standing before the crowd, Nashville residents, officials, and elderly people with hopeful eyes, I knew this was my chance to speak the truth, not just for Grandpa, but for everyone like him. I stood up, took a deep breath, and told the whole story. I spoke of the day at the Atlanta station, how Grandpa was abandoned, how his dream was twisted into a tool for greed. I talked about his test, the secret fortune he'd kept hidden, and how he chose me not because I deserved it, but because I was the only one who stood by him. My voice trembled, but I didn't stop. My grandfather wasn't poor, nor was he naive, I said, looking directly at the crowd. He just wanted to see who still had humanity. And there's only one truth. His own family abandoned him at that station. The room fell silent, then erupted in applause. Strangers shook my hand, thanking me for giving them a voice. Elderly people hugged me, their eyes brimming with tears, as if I'd told their own stories. The community stood with Grandpa and me. My parents, Aunt Paula, Isabel, and James, were left with no room to justify themselves. They had lost all credibility, becoming objects of contempt in the eyes of others. And I, from an investigative journalist, became a defender of justice for my own grandfather. My personal pain had become a collective voice, not just for him, but for countless other elderly people abandoned by those they loved most. I returned to my apartment, where Grandpa was sitting by the window looking out at Nashville. I told him about the meeting, about how the community had stood with us. He only smiled, his eyes gleaming like they did on the farm's porch years ago. "You did well, Christian," he said. "You told our story." I had used my pen to restore justice for Grandpa, but it didn't feel like enough. He deserved more. Not just honor, but the dream he had cherished his entire life. So one evening, as the Nashville streetlights cast their glow on his face, I sat across from him and said, "Grandpa, we're going to take that train trip. From the East Coast to the West, just as you dreamed." He looked at me, his eyes lighting up like a small flame. "Are you sure, Christian?" he asked, his voice hoarse but filled with emotion. I nodded, smiling. "I'm sure. Just the two of us." He let out a laugh, a warm laugh I hadn't heard since that day at the Atlanta station. I didn't know then that by proposing that trip I was opening the final journey for the two of us. A journey not just across America, but through memories, pain, and love that had never faded. I used a portion of the fortune he left me to book the cross-country train trip, exactly as he had envisioned. No luxurious hotels, no expensive restaurants, just the two of us. An old suitcase and train cars carrying us from New York through Chicago, Denver, San Francisco, and ending in Los Angeles. As the train pulled away from the East Coast, I sat beside him in the carriage, looking out the window. He sat there, his hand lightly holding mine, his eyes shining as if he were a boy exploring the world for the first time. Each stop was a piece of his life. In Chicago, he spoke of his days working on the railroads when he was young, when every train was an adventure. "Back then, I thought I could conquer the world," he said, his voice tinged with nostalgia. In Denver, he recalled the hard days raising my parents and Aunt Paula, the sleepless nights worrying about their school fees. "I didn't want them to grow up lacking anything," he said, but his eyes held a fleeting sadness, as if he had always known their greed would make them forget his sacrifices. In San Francisco, as we stood before the shimmering ocean, he spoke of the hopes he once held and the sorrows he had never shared. I sat beside him, scribbling down every word, not just as a journalist, but as a grandson determined to preserve his spiritual legacy. One evening on the train, as the sunset painted the windows gold, he held my hand and smiled. "You've given me my final journey," he said, his voice soft but full of emotion. "And I've given you my entire life." His words left me choked up. I didn't know how to respond, only tightened my grip on his hand, feeling the warmth of his calloused palm as if I were holding an entire world. At the final stop in Los Angeles by the Pacific Ocean, he grew weaker. He still smiled, his eyes still bright, but I could see him slowing down, like a train nearing its last station. One night in a small hotel near the station, he held my hand and whispered, "Now I can close my eyes in peace. Live like this train, Christian, always moving forward but never forgetting the stations you've passed." I nodded, tears silently falling. That night he passed away in his sleep, peacefully, as if he had completed his final journey, not just across America, but through his entire life. I notified the family of his passing, but no one responded. My parents, Aunt Paula, Isabel, James, they were indifferent, cold, as if he had never existed. The family conflict, their greed and their shame had turned them away. I arranged his funeral in our hometown myself. Only close neighbors, those who had once listened to his stories, came to say goodbye. Not a single family member showed up. I stood by his grave, holding the old train ticket, feeling as if the world was just me and him. Materially, the $15 million fortune was legally transferred to me. But to me, Grandpa's true legacy wasn't the money. It was the journey filled with memories on that train, the stories he told, the lessons about truth and pride. 2 years later, I founded a charity in his name, dedicated to helping abandoned elderly people. I wanted his legacy to live on, not just in me, but in those who needed it most. Years later, as a well-known journalist, I still carried that old train ticket. During an interview, I held it up to the camera, my voice trembling. The truth can be left behind at the station, but it can also board the train with you and travel to the end of your life. My grandfather taught me that. And I knew somewhere he was smiling, just as he did on the farm's porch all those years ago.